Okay, hello everybody. My name is Megan Beets. I work with Mr. LaRouche's scientific research team down in our national center out of Purcellville, Virginia, Leesburg, Virginia. I want to pick up on, what I want to talk about today is the human mind. And I want to pick up where Daniel left off with the theme of Glass-Steagall. And Mr. LaRouche said last night in his webcast that and he's been saying repeatedly in meetings as we've approached this breaking point with the breakthrough you all saw yesterday of Glass-Steagall being finally introduced into the Senate. Mr. LaRouche has been saying, look, okay, good, we're doing well, but we have to be thinking about the next step. And the issue we're facing today is that almost nobody actually understands what Glass-Steagall is. Now, people might be able to rattle off for you the banking law and rattle off, section 1, part whatever, the text of the bill. But what we're really discussing is something with much deeper implications. And last night in the webcast, he said, look, people don't actually understand what Glass-Steagall is because people don't actually understand what the human species is. And so what we need all of our supporters to do is actually take on this challenge of mastering a conception of what is the nature of the human species in the universe. What does and to invert that, what does the universe expect of the human species? Assuming we have a future. So I want to take up, what I want to do is I want to throw out some thoughts, and I want to provoke some discussion around this. And where I'm going to start is with somebody that some of you may have heard of, some of you may be familiar with, some not, which is Vladimir Vernadsky. Vernadsky was, I'll pull up a picture here. Vernadsky was born in 1863, and he died in 1945. So his life basically spanned one of the most tumultuous and revolutionary periods of human history. He was born into Tsarist Russia. He died in the Soviet Union right at the end of World War II. So you can imagine the kind of transformation he saw. He saw the birth of flight. He saw and oversaw both the beginnings of the nuclear program and the space program in the Soviet Union. He saw the development and our mastery of the idea of the atom. So he, not only did he witness all of this, he contributed tremendously. And what I hope you'll get a sense of from some of the quotes that I'm going to present and I want us to discuss is that what Vernadsky has contributed to human thought, it's like he just presented it and then walked off the stage. It hasn't really been developed and absorbed by society yet. While I'm on the topic, this is the latest issue of 21st Century Science and Technology. And this is the LaRouche Movement Scientific Magazine, which I encourage everybody to get a subscription to. And the current issue is celebrating the 150th anniversary of Vernadsky's birth. So, what I'll tell you about Vernadsky is that he was a biogeochemist, which means that he was a scientist of the geology of the planet, but including the aspect of life. And he had a completely revolutionary conception of life. And he's very polemical. In many of his writings, he makes the polemic. He said, look, everybody's running around trying to answer the question, what is life? But that's actually the wrong question. You're never going to get an answer to that question formulated in that way. What is life? And you imagine the biologist trying to find life in the living organism. Well, you're never going to do it, right? There's no element of life. There's no, and Vernadsky makes this point very clearly, there's no mineral that's present in living things that is not also present in everything else. You dissect the thing to try to find it, life is gone. And so he didn't ask that question. He asked the question, well, what does living matter do on the planet? What is the action of living matter, and what change has it caused to the development of the planet over the course of its existence? Now, I'm going to say something a little bit more about that in a minute, but first I wanted to throw out, so you have it in your mind, because he not only took up the question of what is life, he took up the question of what is human life. So what I want to do is read a couple passages on his idea, some of his thoughts about human life, and then I'll return and say a few more things about animal life per se. So if people want me to repeat any of this, just let me know. It's a longer passage, but I think it's also very clear. So he says, this is from a work called Scientific Thought as a Planetary Phenomenon. And he says, we are now fully living through its prominent entry in the geological history of the planet. By it, he's talking about something he calls the Noosphere, or the domain of the influence of human scientific thought and work. We are now fully living through its prominent entry in the geological history of the planet. The intensive growth of the influence of a single species of living matter, civilized mankind, on the biosphere is observable during the last millennia. The biosphere is transitioning into a new state, into the noosphere, under the influence of scientific thought and human labor. Mankind is encompassing the whole planet, is distinguishing itself, is diverging from other living organisms as a new, unprecedented geological force. An ever-growing set of inert natural bodies, now by that he means things like new minerals, concentrations of metals, new for the biosphere, and new great natural phenomena are being created by mankind in the biosphere at a speed comparable to that of reproduction, expressible by a geometric progression in the course of time. The biosphere is changing drastically in front of our eyes, and there can hardly be any doubt that its transformation, manifested in this way by scientific thought through organized human labor, is not an arbitrary phenomenon depending on the will of man, but is a tempestuous natural process whose roots lie deep and had been prepared by an evolutionary process whose duration is calculated in the hundreds of millions of years. Man must understand, as only a scientific conception of the world can encompass this, that he is not an arbitrary, freely acting natural phenomenon, independent of his surroundings, the biosphere and the noosphere. He comprises an unavoidable manifestation of a great natural process, lawfully stretching throughout the course of at least 2 billion years. In the present time, now keep in mind, when I read this next sentence, I mean, he could be talking about today. In the present time, under the influence of the surrounding horrors of life, along with an unprecedented flowering of scientific thought, people speak of the approach of barbarity, of the breakdown of civilization, of the self-annihilation of mankind. These attitudes and these reasonings appear to me to be consequences of insufficiently deep penetration into our surroundings. Scientific thought not having entered everyday life yet, we are still living under the strong influence of philosophical and religious habits, not corresponding to the reality of contemporary knowledge, which we have still not grown out of. Scientific knowledge, being manifested as a geological force, creating the noosphere, cannot lead to results which contradict that geological process, whose creation it is. This is not an arbitrary phenomenon. Its roots are extremely deep. So I'll spare you the next passage because it says basically the same thing. This is from a couple sections later, but the point he makes in this section is that even the efforts of, as he calls them, government formations to try to suppress the development of humanity will not succeed. Now, I find this incredibly provocative when you think about what he's really saying. He's saying that, because sort of wrap your mind around what he's saying about you, right? That, or about, things like government policies or the work of a scientist or an artist. He's saying, okay, yes, these things have all contributed to what he's calling the advancement, the coming into being of the noosphere. But he's also saying that even if you tried to reverse that, it wouldn't work. Because the manifestation of mankind and mankind's influence over the development of the environment and the planet is a natural phenomenon, which cannot be opposed. So keep that in mind. We're going to come back to it. One more thing I'll just throw in the mix here. This is from a paper called Some Words About the Noosphere that he wrote in 1945, shortly before he died. It's very short. He says, here, a new riddle has arisen before us. Thought is not a form of energy. How then can it change material processes? That question has not as yet been solved. Do people understand what he's saying there? He's saying, okay, we're claiming that it's the scientific thought of man which is responsible for new minerals that didn't exist before we got here, all the moving of Earth, right? Discovery is responsible for this, but discovery and thought is not a form of energy. So how is it moving all of this material? How is it responsible for that? So hopefully you get the sense already that that Vernadsky is an extremely profound thinker. And we'll get back to it. Now, just returning for a moment to his idea of the biosphere and of living matter. Now, Vernadsky looked at a living being, like a living organism, a dog, a cat, something like that. The way he saw that organism was not the same as a biologist. Now, a biologist would look at a dog and classify a dog according to what? Its shape, how many legs it has, if it's warm-blooded or cold-blooded, right? And would describe the appearance and the mechanisms inside the animal, give it a classification. Vernadsky didn't do that. He said, okay, any body, any living piece of living matter, including your own body, is not actually fixed. And by that, what he means, and people might know this, is that, hey Jessica, is that the atoms and the minerals and the things in your body are constantly in flux. You've been ingesting and expelling atoms from your body for your entire life. So there's nothing fixed about the stuff that makes up your body. And a good image for this that he uses is a whirlpool. So people can imagine a body of water with a whirlpool in it, right? Now, at any one moment, there's water constantly passing through the whirlpool. So from one moment to the next, it's not the same water, but yet the structure is fixed. Can people imagine this? Or like you can even imagine a tornado. It's sort of a similar image, right? You have a fixed funnel structure, and yet the air and the things passing through it are not the same. It's like a stream. Well, the living body is the same thing, and he compares it to a vortex, a whirlpool. Now, what's been the effect of, and this is true of every living piece of living matter, down to the tiniest single-celled little bacteria. So now, what's been the effect of this action of life over the past, it's looking like about 4 billion years now that life's been on the planet that we can tell? Well, one thing he brings up is, what has life done to transform the Earth? It's created the atmosphere. It's created free oxygen in the atmosphere, which has transformed everything. It's transformed the kinds of chemical reactions that can occur on the planet. This would not have happened had living beings not been pumping out oxygen through their metabolic processes. It's concentrated minerals. One example he brings up is calcium. Prior to the what's called the Cambrian period, I forget exactly how long ago that was, very, very long ago, a couple billion years, where life first developed hard shells on the outside, which were mostly calcium-based. Well, at this point, life was mainly in the ocean, actually primarily in the oceans. There was no life on land at this point, not that we can tell, except maybe some bacteria. So you're talking about life in the oceans, which finally develops this hard exoskeleton, which is mostly calcium, which means that these little organisms are sucking in what used to be this spread out calcium throughout the oceans, concentrating it, and then when they die, this gets concentrated into what we know as mineral deposits. The same thing happens with iron, right? So you look at life. To sum it up, over the course of the past 4 billion years, what we know is that the action of these little whirlpools of pieces of living matter have been taking the crust of the earth, taking the matter of the earth, reorganizing it, and creating a state in the biosphere which is actually of a higher potential, meaning you can have higher energy reactions occurring, right? You have a higher concentration of things, more potential for action in the future. This is completely revolutionary, by the way.
Can you describe the cyanobacteria again and that concentration of the iron?
Yes, it's a good example. I don't remember how many hundreds of thousands or whatever, billions of years ago, but at a certain point you had the oceans, within the oceans you had free iron. And you had this little bacteria, cyanobacteria, which actually would use the iron to metabolize. Now, at a certain, and this had been going on for a long time, so these little bacteria would eat up the iron, die, make an iron deposit, and then the iron would build back up, and so on. At a certain point, you had a kind of cyanobacteria come about that would metabolize the iron and pump out oxygen. So these little bacteria started eating up the iron, pumping out oxygen. At a certain point, you had a saturation of the atmosphere and then beginning to go down into the oceans of oxygen, which was toxic to almost everything else alive in the oceans at that time. And you had a mass extinction of most of life in the ocean. I forget, it's something like 90-something% of species during this time period went extinct. Yeah, when you get this oxygen, I mean, this was like the climate, whatever, environmental crisis of the.
And before that, there was probably methane. Methane may have been the gas.
I forget. Yeah, the composition of the atmosphere was completely different, and so anything, anything that wasn't actually adjusted to be able to metabolize oxygen was completely wiped out. Yeah, like we need certain minerals to keep our bodies going, to keep the reactions of our muscles going. We need potassium and iron and all these things. Well, these little bacteria would use the iron to create the energy they needed to live and to multiply. And they give off oxygen. They killed pretty much everything else around it. It took a while. It wasn't like overnight, but geologically speaking, it was overnight. It might have been a couple thousand years or something. Now, the interesting thing about this is from the standpoint of the current system, this was a complete genocide, right? I mean, just everything died off. Now, looking back on it, what did this do? What breathes oxygen, right? Pretty much every higher life form that came after this needs the oxygen, right, to be able to do what? To be able to live, to multiply at a higher rate than those organisms that came before. So the organisms that could exist after, in this whole billions of years after this complete change, right, are of a higher power than what came before. Now, Vernadsky called this process of the movement of materials through this vortex of living matter and then back out into the biosphere, he called it the biogenic migration of atoms. So biogenic means caused by life or begun by life, right? The biogenic migration of atoms or migration of materials. Now, he makes a couple points about this. One thing he says is he points out something very interesting, which is that if you take the amount or the weight of living matter, or matter which is currently in a living body, and you take that as a percentage of the entire crust of the Earth, we're talking about something like 0.1%. I might even be way overestimating that. But you're talking about the amount of living matter is minuscule compared to the amount of matter in the whole crust of the Earth. And yet, what's the more powerful process? What's had a greater effect in a shorter time, right? It's the living process, not the abiotic process. Now, he makes another point about the biogenic migration of atoms, which is that this is not that the type of biogenic migration which takes the material through the body, through the metabolism and then passes it back out, that's not the only form of biogenic migration of atoms. There's another form of how life actually changes and moves about materials, which he calls technology. And one example he gives it's kind of a simple example, but one example he gives, and you guys can imagine this, are burrowing animals. So it's a small amount, but there has been a certain change and reorganization of the crust due to animals that actually move stuff around, build stuff, reorganize materials. Yeah, it's a technology. Or you think about how these organisms will build little nests for themselves. They'll concentrate certain kinds of materials and build their habitats, or something like that. Huh? Exactly. It aerates the soil, creates a different potential chemistry. So this is due to technology. Now I'm going to, again, come back to this because you guys probably have in your minds that there's one kind of animal that does this more than others. I am going to get back to this idea of technology. Before I do that, and now this is kind of for fun, but it also is making an important point. I want to share with you a particular class of organisms. It's close to a jellyfish, but it's not a jellyfish. There we go. Anybody know what kind of sea creature this is? It's called a Portuguese Man OWar. And these are, people might have, you don't want to be in the water with this thing. Okay? Yeah, they're related to jellyfish. It's actually of a class of organisms called siphonophores. And I forget how many types. I think it's like 150 different types of siphonophores that we know about. There are probably many more. How many organisms is this? Yeah, how many organisms is this?
Oh, you mean within that one creature?
Well, that's the question, right? Yeah. I'm kind of posing it in a way that tells you something, but...
You can't count it as one creature.
What's that?
So it's organized.
More than that. You can have anywhere from several dozen to several hundred individual organisms in one of these. And I was shocked by this. The largest man OWar that we've measured in terms of tentacle length is somewhere in the range of 40 to 50 meters long. These are some of the largest creatures in the ocean by length. So here's the paradox. You're talking, let's say, a conservative estimate, you're talking a few dozen individuals here. But then how do they act? Why does it look like that, right? It looks like one thing. And here's the interesting thing. If you look at the functions, you have this, I forget what they call it, but this thing it's like a bladder that's filled with air. It floats on top of the water. Here you have cells which can feed and digest the prey. And they're not cells, they're individuals which can feed and digest the prey. You have individuals which can release gametes for mating. And then you have individuals which make up these tentacle structures which can sting prey and defend the organism, defend the colony.
So are they able to separate out?
Not at this point. No, after the growth process begins, they actually can't separate. But they are different. It is a colony. Now the interesting thing is, once an individual, they call it a zoophyte, has become a certain type of guy, it can't do any of the other functions for the colony. So if you've become a feeding, digesting thing, you can't sting, you can't mate, you can't do any of these things. You can only do what you can do, and yet the whole thing functions and moves and swims as if it were one creature. You mean like if you break it off or something?
Well, if you have a cell that's for, say, pancreatic production of insulin,
Right.
so that's all it will be able to do
Once it's differentiated. Yeah, exactly. Now there are different types of siphonophores, and I think some of them can function differently, but I'll just show you because they're really interesting. This is another one of these colonial type organisms. This is another one. That's the Portuguese Man OWar's float. That's another one.
Like flowers.
I think it looks like a chicken. See? Yeah. Anyway, the biosphere is very fascinating. So this is just very fun. But it also raises a question, which is, how do we set the boundary of what we mean by an individual? How do we set the boundary of what we mean by when we say an organism? And when you think about a dog seems to be one thing. It's got a will, it can listen to you, and does what it wants to do. Right, so we'd say that's an individual. Given this is more primitive, but I think it does raise an important point, which is where do you draw the boundary of an individual action in the biosphere? Because you think about this organism, in a sense, what you have is you have a whole grouping of organisms which are gripped by a whole. They participate in the whole, right? There's some kind of wholeness to all of these individual animals which are part of this thing. Now, there are implications of this if you think back to what I was saying about the biosphere and how all these little animals over the course of billions of years have been sucking up this material and pumping it back out. And there are implications for this because if we look at the history, and Vernadsky does this in a very, very good paper called The Evolution of Species something. I can get it to people, but he recognizes the fact that it hasn't just been the same biosphere over time, but there's clearly been an evolution. And what he goes through in this paper is that there's clearly been an evolution in a certain direction of the biosphere. And I sort of already mentioned it, but what he pinpoints is that over the course of time, the rate of the biogenic migration of atoms, and therefore the power of life to change the planet, has only been increasing. It has never gone the other way. Now, you might have had periods when it was increasing more slowly or seemed to stagnate, but it never went backwards. There's never retrogression in the biosphere. It's always moving forwards. And he makes the point that, look, this is countless, it kind of puts Darwin, throws him out the window, because, Darwin's claim is that it's been all these random mutations which have somehow added up to this unified effect of the biosphere. And Vernadsky says, no. What you're witnessing is a larger process of the development of life. And you have, just like we talk about different materials and atoms passing through the body of the individual, well, similarly, you've had, passing through the process of life over time, you've had countless species which have come up, played the function they were supposed to play, and died off. So that's how he characterizes evolution, that there's been a singular effect of the development of life on the planet over time. And no matter what any of the individual species thought they were doing, without their realizing it, they were contributing to this one, what we can observe as one effect. Now, this gets me back to the noosphere. And sure. What's that?
The Portuguese Man OWar.
Yes. Actually, yeah. I think it's more purple, pink, but it gets back to what I mentioned before about technology.
One thing about that Portuguese Man OWar,
Uh-huh.
the stingers, like you said, they can be so many meters long. You see that thing floating on the top, and you think if you stay away from it,
Right.
you'll be okay.
Right.
Like in the water,
Right.
when you're swimming or something. But the tentacles can reach out so far that you can be all the way over here and get very badly stung
Yeah.
by that creature that you see way over here.
Yeah.
So if you see one in the water, get out of the water.
But then, do you know what's
Experience, Jessica?
what's interesting about that? That's true, and that's true for most species. But there are actually these certain species of fish, which they're not quite sure why. They have hypotheses, but there are certain species of fish which actually live in the tentacles. They actually live among the tentacles and feed. Yeah. Right, but it's just yeah.
Clownfish.
Yeah.
There's a clownfish that lives, and the tentacles do not bother them.
Right.
And the actual Portuguese Man OWar protects the little clownfish.
Right.
So then the predators that come after the clownfish, they see the fish in there and they want to get to it, and
Right.
they try, and the stingers kill it.
Right.
Not just sting it, they actually kill the predators that are coming after the clownfish.
Yes.
The clownfish just kind of floats around with that other creature.
Right.
And it's protecting it all the time.
Right. Yeah.
Sometimes it ventures out to find food on its own, but it always comes back.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
It's like gangster stuff.
So returning to humans, because hopefully people realize the reason I raised this siphonophore anomaly is because it's really not so much of an anomaly. And it has implications on the noosphere also, which is sort of where I want to go with this whole thing. So I want to return to the noosphere. And remember before I brought up the issue of the biogenic migration of atoms due to technology. Now, Vernadsky recognizes that there's one species on the planet which uses technology to a greater result than any other, which is obviously man. And so here, I'll just read this. This is from the paper, The Evolution of Species and Living Matter. He says, the role of civilized humanity from the point of view of the biogenic migration of atoms was infinitely more important than that played by the other vertebrates. Here, for the first time in the history of the Earth, the biogenic migration due to the development of the action of technology was able to have a greater significance than the biogenic migration determined by the mass of living matter. Now that's huge. That's a huge statement. And he's not saying that just because he wants it to be true. It's because they actually did the studies. So I'll just read that sentence again. He says, for the first time in the history of the Earth, the biogenic migration due to the development of the action of technology was able to have a greater significance than the biogenic migration determined by the mass of living matter. At the same time, the biogenic migrations changed for all of the elements. So in other words, things like silicon, phosphorus, all these things which had a certain cycle through living matter, we gave it a new cycle by mining, by building machinery, right? We actually changed the cycles of these different elements through our technological action. The process, huh? Well, I mean, one example we could use is the water cycle on the North American continent. Like, think about, I don't know if you've seen the NOAAPA videos that have been put out discussing the water cycle. So most drops of water that fall on the North American continent west of the Rockies have a very particular cycle, which is that they fall on the land. They might evaporate and rain back down one or two more times, but they eventually flow out to the Pacific. Those same drops of water evaporate, form storm clouds. Most of that is actually blown up to Alaska, right? Rains down. When it melts, right? So it has a cycle. Elements have a cycle too, right? Calcium, depending on what period you're talking about in the biosphere and what types of animals are alive then, different elements have different cycles too. Like you'd have these little shelled organisms which will absorb and concentrate the calcium from the water, right? They die, they fall down, right? And there are ways in which these elements are released back into the biosphere. Now we change those pathways by, for example, mining iron. We mine iron ore. We put it through a manufacturing process, right? We concentrate it. We build rail. Now the iron has a cycle and is present in a different, spread out over a different time scale than it would have had without the intervention of human beings. So we give a new organization to the materials of the biosphere, which they could not have had without the action of scientific thought.
Well, I understand you say it's been changed, but what does do thereafter? It's like
Well, right.
life is finished. It has no life anymore.
Well, no. Actually, we'll get to this, because then the question is, what are human beings using it for? Right? Just like an animal might, a new kind of species might use calcium where no other species used it before, but then that organism was able to do something different that other organisms couldn't. Right. We can do something different. So we'll get to that. So now just this closing idea, he says, the face of the earth transformed itself in an unrecognizable way, and yet it is clear that the era of this transformation has only just begun. Now, we already sort of got to this too, but I do want to also read to you this wonderful passage from this same paper, Scientific Thought as a Planetary Phenomenon, because now we have established that mankind uses this technologically based biomigration of atoms. We're changing the planet. We're reorganizing the material of the planet in an unprecedented way. Now, how does this happen? Because it's not just one individual that does that. Like, you can't just be you out there, right, doing all of this. So he says, the research scientist living a life of purely scientific work of large or small extent is one of the creators of scientific knowledge. Individual people connected to considerations which are scientifically important but often are foreign to science, revealing scientific facts and scientific generalizations, sometimes fundamental and decisive. Hypotheses and theories widely used in science come forward accidentally, or that is, by the means of everyday life, out of the thick of life, along with the scientist. No less, but often rather more powerful, now more powerful than the scientist in his laboratory for causing this progress, more powerful have been those changes which have occurred in economic life, in agriculture, or in individual manifestations of success in everyday life. Like, for example, the introduction of the camel in the desert and semi-desert areas of northern Africa, and the discovery of printing in the Rhenish countries of Europe. Along with these tempestuous phenomena, whose consequences for scientific thought were not considered at their creation by mankind, to an equal and sometimes perhaps greater degree than scientific thought itself. The scientific discoveries of individual thinkers and scientists, which change mankind's worldview, like Copernicus, Newton, Linnaeus, Darwin, Pasteur, the Curies, acting in the biosphere. And I like this last part. In some cases, this was done consciously. In others, unexpectedly for the scientist himself, as occurred before our eyes with Becquerel discovering radioactivity in 1896, or with Ørsted detecting electromagnetism, or with Galvani discovering the galvanic current. Now what he's making 2 points which are sort of the same point. The first one was that even greater than the individual scientist who's making a discovery in his laboratory, even more significant for the penetration of scientific action into the biosphere and that change are the unconscious actions of countless individuals, and he mentioned agriculture, economic life, other considerations, which I would add the idea of organization of governments. Things that aren't explicitly a scientific discovery, which yet have been the basis and really more important aspect of the penetration of human scientific action into the planet. Now, the second point he makes, which is sort of the same point, is this last one, that sometimes these discoveries come even unexpectedly for the scientist himself. So to me, this raises the siphonophore point, which is if the little guys which make up the siphonophore, or thinking more generally, the animals within the biosphere as a whole, are gripped by a process which is greater than themselves, then what's gripping man? And how, this is the more exciting part, how is it gripping man? Now, just to make it more explicit, you think about all of human history. Now, Vernadsky makes this point that you have historical explanations for phenomena. You have a historical explanation for the development of agriculture here, for this war, for these people being annihilated. You have certain explanations. And he says, actually, those aren't the real reasons. The real reasons have to do with the fact that the planet is being developed to a higher state and that man plays a crucial role in this. Let's see if I've got everything there. So then this is kind of the point. This, just to get back to what I opened with on the idea of Glass-Steagall, what LaRouche said last night in the webcast, that people don't really understand Glass-Steagall because they don't really understand or have a conception of the human species and the role that the human species has to play in the universe. What is humanity gripped by? Well, creativity. Human individuals possess creativity. Human individuals can have creative ideas which have true effects and consequences on the material surrounding them. So there's this unique power of the human organism, which looks like an animal. A lot of people act like animals, which seems to have an animal apparatus. But there's a unique power of every human creature to tap into what is an ongoing creative process and to pull out little pieces of that in the form of new creative breakthroughs which didn't exist before. Now, another way you could say that, which I like better, is not that so much that human beings are tapping into creativity, but that creativity is tapping into us. That the development of human civilization, whatever we thought we were doing or why we were doing that, is actually being animated by an ongoing process of creativity which is higher than any individual person or individual state of the noosphere. Now, I just wanted to, I don't have time to go through it here. I wish we had like 5 hours. But one of the... That's right. Yes, the noosphere. The noosphere dominating the biosphere.
any creativity at all, or do they
Well,
have none?
here's the interesting thing. As individuals, no.
None at all.
Not as individuals, right?
As individuals.
You know, an animal cannot change its behavior. It might be able to adapt a little bit, but an animal cannot fundamentally change the effect that its species is having on the surrounding biosphere, right? Now, as a whole, over time, through the evolution of species, the dying off of certain species, the rising of new species, yes, the biosphere as a whole does exhibit creativity. It does exhibit that. Now, here's the unique thing about human beings, is that the quality of changes that you saw the biosphere going through, right, of the bringing in of new organisms which have a fundamentally different relationship and power over the surrounding material, we can do that within a single generation. We can actually do that many times within the span of a single generation of human beings. Now, how do we do it? We don't change our bodies. But remember, Vernadsky said that's not the primary way we affect the development of the planet. We change our ideas. We actually reorganize and make extinct, you could say, outmoded ideas, outmoded ways of understanding and having power over the surrounding universe. And we do that through breakthroughs, through creative, scientific breakthroughs which did not exist before. An example of that, because it is a complex, fascinating and complex thing. Fusion, right? Fusion is occurring all over the place. It's occurring on our sun. Human beings can make it happen on the planet. And we do that through a discovery, right? We don't do it through anything having to do with our biology. Now, we need our biology to pick things up, manufacture the apparatus, build the building, make it happen. But the understanding of fusion is not detected by any of our senses. It doesn't come to us biologically. It comes through the mind. Now, here's kind of where I want to leave it, is that is the primary question that I raised at the beginning. How is it that creativity grips man? What is the form that this takes? This goes back to Couza, right? Couza was the first to really establish in the modern era the relationship of the mind of man to God's mind, the mind of man to the creativity of the universe. And he asserted that, no, man is not just a beast, which is limited to the understanding of his senses and to some kind of logical deduction. But he actually claimed, or asserted rather, that mankind, through a leap, through a wild hunch, through a hypothesis, can actually tap into and have a premonition of a true principle of the universe. Your conceptions, and this is the other personality I want to bring in, is Kepler, who was a close follower of Couza. Kepler said the same thing. Your conceptions can actually mirror those of God's conceptions, or of the conceptions which are governing the unfolding of the development of the solar system. And Kepler has this wonderful, I think it's a letter, where he says that, not every eerie hunch you have is wrong. Most of them are actually right. And that's the form in which these ideas come to us, is through eerie hunches. And so there's just a couple things I wanted to throw in. One is some of the thoughts of Max Planck, who's a very, very important personality to get to know. Planck, he did. He discovered the quantum.
An electron goes from a higher orbit to a lower orbit, it emits a quantum of light.
Well, we've detected the quantum, right? We know about the quantum, but the whole idea of why, what's causing these things, what does this mean? I mean, we don't know. But no, he's a very important figure, and he actually, if people know who Wilhelm Furtwängler is, he was also a very important figure, a composer, a conductor. Planck studied counterpoint, which is a musical composition, with the same teacher that Furtwängler studied with. Planck, when he was a young man, had to choose between becoming a professional concert pianist and becoming a physicist. And he became a physicist. He just chose physics. So anyway, here's what Planck says. This is in an interview in 1931. He says, "There is certainly a kinship between science and art. But at the same time, the differences are very marked. Science is the result of the desire for knowledge. The beauty of science arises from the fact that there exists a close connection between truth and beauty. The connection is probably due to the very structure of our minds. But the primary aim of the scientific man is not beauty, but knowledge. In this, he differs from the artist, whose primary concern is beauty. But in his search for beauty, the artist can also reveal to us truth and knowledge. Thus, science and art are akin." Albert Einstein. "Thus, the supreme task of the physicist is the discovery of the most general elementary laws from which the world picture can be deduced logically. But there is no logical way to the discovery of these elemental laws. There is only the way of intuition, which is helped by a feeling for the order lying behind the appearances. And this Einfühlung, which means like a feeling, like a premonition, a feeling, is developed by experience." And then Einstein also cites other places that, because he's asked, where do you get your ideas? And this is not an exact quote, but what he always references is music. It's a sense for beauty, which is developed, and the kind of state that the mind can be in, that the artistic mind can be in.
He did say, I believe, that several points that had he not been able to play the violin, because he would not have been able to make the scientific discoveries that he
Yes, absolutely. This is fun. This is our old friend Vernadsky. "Music seems to me to be the deepest expression of human consciousness. For even in poetry, in science, and in philosophy, where we are operating with logical concepts and words, man involuntarily and always limits and often distorts that which he experiences and understands. Within the bounds of Tchaikovsky's 'a thought once uttered is untrue,' in music we maintain unuttered thoughts. It would be quite interesting to follow in a concrete way the obvious influence of music on scientific thought. Does it excite inspiration?" There's just a couple more I want to read, which I think throw in slightly different elements, and then we should discuss it. This is from LaRouche. This is from a draft paper that he's not done with, called A New Meaning for Space. LaRouche says, "There is no basis for permitting exclusion of devotion to such transcendental qualities of universal principles as the set of life per se, love per se, and beauty per se. These are the exemplary purpose of the existence of the human species in the universe, whether in the past, present, or, above all else, the distant future. Our proper existence as mankind, in particular, is dependent upon creative qualities within us. Creative because the causes lie beyond the reach of those deductions associated with the notions of sense certainties." People catch that? I think I'll leave it there in terms of quotes, but I would just, to close and then we can have some discussion, I would just say that, when we're talking about the kind of future we could have, under the passage of Glass-Steagall, under the credit system, with the implementation of the NWAPA project. Those things really are subordinated to and are means to an end. And that end really does lie in the, I think still not quite answered question of what is the human species and what is our role in the universe. Now, what do we know? We know that the human species is the only species that can possibly willfully get off of this planet. And the kind of process that we saw occurring on the Earth, and my kind of brief sweep through the history of life and the transformation of the biosphere, as far as we know, we are the only creature that could do that on other planets at this point. So the kind of role we have to play, number one, it's unique. Number two, it is where we have to think of going with the passage of Glass-Steagall. So the implication of Glass-Steagall is not just some kind of, oh good, we're going to fix the nasty banking system and go back to normal. No, this is an evolution. This is an evolutionary process. We're finally going to bring the ideas of Vernadsky and LaRouche, and if people know, LaRouche has written papers uniting his ideas with Vernadsky's in economics. We're finally going to implement Vernadsky's ideas as a conscious policy of man changing the planet. That's going to be our standard for economic value. There is a truthful standard for economic value. It is not whatever the markets say. There's a way to measure it. There's a standard for culture. There's actually a truth in culture. There's a truth in art. It is not just whatever you feel like at the moment. And that's sort of that's also just the real fallacy of what people think today, right? Is that people think, well, no, this is my culture. How dare you criticize my culture? This is what I like. How dare you criticize the, human creatives? Well, guess what? Most of popular music was manufactured in a laboratory, right? Most popular music, right, was already designed as a form back in the actually, you can go far back as the 1820s, the 1830s, but more explicitly, the 1930s and the 1940s. There were psychological studies done of how to use culture and music and sound to mess up people's creativity. It was done under the CCF, under the Frankfurt School, under the Hollywood Project, right? The movie soundtrack came out of this. So you could associate your emotions with these cheesy, right? The emotions of your music with these cheesy.
You mean Hollywood?
Yeah.
Mysteries or love stories?
Yeah. Right. So if people get all riled up about, oh, this is my music. Well, no, that's not your music, right? This was designed to dumb people down. But when we talk about real culture, what's the purpose of art? What's the purpose of real culture? It's to train the mind to think creatively. To train the mind to think creatively and to celebrate the creative mind. And to actually, what's the quickest way to disseminate creativity throughout your population? Have a concert hall in every town, right? Start your children in musical composition classes, things like, right? So this really is the conception I sort of want to lay on the table of what is the implication of Glass-Steagall and what do we have to make sure it means, because we all have a responsibility to make sure that we go for full victory. And I can tell you this is the idea that we're taking into the Congress on a daily and weekly basis, is fighting with the aides, with the policymakers, with the congressmen, yes, over the policy, but no, over the nature of man and what they don't understand.
What did you say, CC? What was
It's the CCF, the Congress for Cultural Freedom,
Congress for Cultural?
which was funded by the CIA under Truman to sponsor so-called artists, musicians, and so forth under the pretext of fighting communism and spreading Western culture. But did they spread Beethoven and Mozart? No, right? No, they spread arbitrary art.
And what was the other one you mentioned?
The Frankfurt School was a certain philosophical grouping of Germans, but a lot of them were Jews who would have been Nazis, except they weren't allowed. And they weren't qualified.
But they were
Huh?
part of this. They were part of this scientific group.
Yeah, Hannah Arendt, right? Theodor Adorno are some of the personalities involved.
The names
Hannah Arendt. I can write down the names afterwards. And Theodore Adorno, some of the people involved, right? Who were the personalities that were the spokesmen for the idea that to say there's truth is fascism. To say there's truth is tyranny. And you have to celebrate what makes you human, which is your feelings, feeling good, the most, banal, bestial expressions of your true nature, right? So-called.
Authoritarian personality.
Yeah.
Denied people like Roosevelt.
Yeah.
And so forth at the time.
Yeah. So if you say that you know what to do, you're a fascist. You're imposing your will on the population, right? So anyway, the point is it's an operation. It was an operation.
Yeah. But I didn't quite know who you were talking about is doing the operating and how.
We actually wrote whole pamphlets on the CCF, which I can
Okay,
find
but
the
private
locations.
school is
Yeah.
totally new to me.
Yeah.
Yes.
A lot of stuff was funded. Anyway, but that's kind of what I wanted to put on the table. So
So are you making the point then that, from what it seems, that this natural development of the universe with which man is at the forefront of now, either both from without and from giving from within, I guess it's that Glass-Steagall in fact allows it allows this to lawfully occur from the financial standpoint.
yeah, it's.
So
I mean, you could think of it as. I almost have a tactile image. I mean, Glass-Steagall really is going to be a pivot point. It's going to be a turning point, a decision for civilization. And the reason it's going to be that is because what does Glass-Steagall recognize as value? Often just the way that economics is distorted these days, people have a hard time of thinking of value as something profound. But the issue of economic value is absolutely profound. Because value is a physical quantity and a quality. It's something physical because it's mankind taking the current state of nature through a scientific discovery and technology, actually upshifting the power of that thing, right? And it's embodied in LaRouche's conception of energy flux density, that man can concentrate power, can actually concentrate processes and create more productivity in the future than in the state that he's existing in. So man's ability to upshift the productivity of the planet and beyond, upshift the productivity of Mars, for example, that's a value. And so the idea of Glass-Steagall is that we are now recognizing as value not money, but physical value. And that's defined by a science of economics, which is a science of the human species.
So this financial law not only acknowledges that, but encourages that.
Implicitly, right? Implicitly. I mean, we kind of have to make sure that that's the case by making sure that we follow Glass-Steagall by getting the national bank and the credit system, right? And these things are all, the point is these policies are all manifestations of an idea. Yeah, of an intention. Exactly. But no, I mean, and that's why Glass-Steagall is such a yes. I mean, you'd think that just going and talking, it makes sense, right? Glass-Steagall makes absolute sense. Well, why is there so much resistance? Because there's an empire, right? Some of you are probably activists and have been trying to, go to Congress or talk to your state officials or whatever, right? And why are you getting so much resistance? Because there's an empire, right? Because Glass-Steagall really does represent this other true conception of humanity, which would take the power away from the empire.
I think with that also, what we're bringing up when we're talking about things like the CCF, Frankfurt School, and so forth, what's going on is that there's two sides to this thing. The idea of rational versus irrational thinking. There's a war going on.
Well, it's true, and here's the point LaRouche always makes about the empire, the Queen of England. They're not human. Now, what does he mean by that? Because he's not just, it is funny, but he's not just saying it to be funny. The Queen of England, Obama, they're not human. Now, it doesn't mean we're gonna treat them like animals. We're gonna treat them like sick people, right? but they're not human, even though they might look human. Now, why? Because the human being is not defined by its biology. The human being is defined by a principle. And right now, and for the past, except for a few moments in history when you've had the potential for something else, like the American Revolution, for the past millennia, you have had the dominance of an empire system, an unbroken empire system, from the Persian Empire, right, through the Roman Empire. I'm probably skipping some, but the Roman Empire, which then took residence in the Venetian Empire, which then took residence in the British Empire, which is exactly what we're dealing with today. And so it's very, like what you're bringing up, these two different views, it's true, it's absolutely true, but it's also true that this other view, it's not just another opinion, it's wrong, and it's not actually human. Mm-hmm.
It's like picturing somebody that's called a Gorgon. It's a Gorgon. When you look at a Gorgon, you want to look at it straight with your eyes. You want to look at it through a mirror. A Gorgon.
Oh, you're talking about the Queen of England?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Man is biologically an animal. He's part of the animal kingdom, but he's the highest form of animal. He has a mind. He can think. He can organize the planet, and so on. The lower animals, so to say, all animals operate by brain. We do too, but the lower animals don't have minds like man does. They live according to the jungle law, like kill, eat, and so on.
Right.
They don't know that they're living on a planet and in the universe.
Right, but here's...
But biologically, man is part of,
Well, here's
the animal.
here's how you got to be careful, though, because you have to be careful because man did not come from a biological process. That's why you got to be careful, because man. Well, here's the paradox. Here's the paradox. Here's the paradox. I understand. No, I understand. I understand. But here's the paradox: is that the human species could not have been a product of living matter. Now the body, right? What you're looking at with the human being is you're not looking at something which is an animal, but just the next step. You're looking at something which is coming from the other direction. You're looking at creativity, which finally had the potential. You finally had an apparatus which could house a creative organism, a creative being. But you've got to be careful because that's the problem we're dealing with today. Is that people think, well, oh yeah, it's dangerous, right? Because what it also implies is that, because the reason it's dangerous is what it also implies is that knowledge comes to the human being via the biological apparatus. And what can be implied by that, the danger you run into there, is the proposal that knowledge comes to the human being via the biological apparatus, from the senses, right? Okay. That I observe the world around me, and I see this, and I hear that, and I smell that, and I put together a picture of the world, right? Remember what I sort of briefly touched on before was, and Einstein and Planck did too, is that that's actually not how new ideas appear to man. New ideas appear to man only as experiences of the mind, and I'm sure everybody has had an experience akin to this. There's an experience of the mind where you can't put it in words. You can't quite externalize it. And every time you try, it's not quite right. Now, some people do succeed, and they're called poets, artists, right? Something like that. But there's a quality of experience which human beings can have, right? Which is an experience of the mind, which we then attempt to externalize. And it does come to you in a flash, and that's exactly how Kepler describes his discovery of gravitation. Is not a logical, well, x plus y minus d, blah, blah, blah. No, he actually describes it explicitly as it just came to him. It just came to him out of nowhere. And at first he said, oh, that's crazy, and he threw it out. And then he realized, oh, wait, this is really something.
You know,
Jessica and I and Suzanne were late today because we went to meet with a congressman in Brooklyn, Jeffries. And at first, after that experience, what Eugene was just saying seems to be an argument for it after experiencing this animal. This well-dressed
Right.
Obama clone,
Right.
right, stuff, where you're not dealing with,
Right.
where everything that we're discussing now, he's incapable of. He's only going to respond to a foot up his ass,
Right.
at best.
Right.
And so, on the ride in, that's what the discussion is. How can we do that? And
Right.
we have some ideas, and we're going to, talk more about that. But it's an experience that is, you don't know what you're going to walk into. You try and prepare, but I really didn't understand what this clone thing is, what these replicas are.
Yeah.
That are a generation behind me in age, yet are there, but are so Manchurian
Right. Right.
in this stuff that you can see how it can sell. Now, this is a district in Brooklyn. I don't know what the population is, but there weren't more than 100 people. There weren't even 100 people. This is a very small turnout, and it's an open house, but obviously it's not. What was most interesting, we met with the aide, one of his top aides earlier, and what she spent the time doing was, you could see her freak out and panic because she knew why we were there. And she actually told Suzanne, you shouldn't be discussing politics here. Because she saw our flash and saw what we were doing. And Suzanne's like, you gotta be kidding me. And no, she was very serious, and so there was a lot of room. So I just wanted to kind of get that off on the subject of evolution, that some people need a lot of
Yep. You're talking about 80% of the Congress. And I'm being generous. Yeah, but no, I said this when some of you were here, some of you weren't. I mean, I primarily work out of our Virginia office, so I get to do the work in DC a lot, and I will tell you that the work that you guys are doing outside of DC, outside of the Beltway, is the crucial factor. I mean, yes, in terms of the direct pummeling in the Congress, but also the leadership. And this is what makes a difference to these guys. So, I mean, I would just throw that out there from the experience inside the heart of the beast, is that the work that you guys are doing out here has been the critical factor.
One of the things that Suzanne and I have here, basically when it's supposed to start, which was 12 o'clock, we were with just a few people there already when we got there. Like Alan said, it wasn't the turnout that you would have expected it to be. This was an open house. One of the reasons I think it wasn't a big turnout is that they tried to narrowly take in constituents. This was supposed to be, but they tried to channel which constituents actually showed up.
Right.
So they had this registration process, first of all. So I registered everybody that I thought might actually help me and might actually come. So anybody that I could think of that might show up, I put their registration in. So that was the first thing to kind of weed out everybody, weed out people, because I'm a constituent. So when I say help me, I mean I'm the constituent, but I'm reaching out to all of my fellow LaRouche members, and we're all constituents. So they don't know. So then we go in, and the first thing they say to Suzanne is, this person that we already met with, Steph, she's all glad to see me and everything, Then she notices that we have information. So she says to Suzanne, I really would hope that you're not giving out any flyers or anything like that. We don't want any distribution, she said, of flyers and stuff. So we were like, okay, all right. So Suzanne and I talked about it, and we said, we are not going to distribute flyers. What we will do is talk to individual people and give them a flyer. So we're not standing there handing them out. we'll just talk to everybody that we can talk to and give it to them. So that's, it's like, what brain power do these people?
Yeah, but I'll tell you, the breakthrough in the Senate. I mean, I was in a meeting with Mr. LaRouche on Thursday. Now, this is the day that this introduction was made, but we didn't know yet. And Mr. LaRouche was making the point on Thursday that, look, the jam up is the Senate. And he was making an important point, which is that bills introduced into the House, there's a bill introduced into the House every day. But it's not serious until you have a companion bill in the Senate, because that means it can actually become law. Then it's real. That's why you've got this, psychotic obsession with trying to stop it in the Senate. So then the next day, and I mean, Daniel read the statement, but what does it signify that we had this breakthrough in the Senate the week we did? I mean, it signifies a lot in terms of the work that we've put into it, but it also signifies that Obama's power, which is the Queen of England's power, is crumbling. The empire's policy is crumbling. This guy is in trouble, right? And you do still have some Obamatons and some of this lying around, but from the more serious people, from the people who have been on the fence, who have been a little colder, these people are breaking. The whole thing's falling apart. The whole thing's coming down. And it's just a really optimistic situation.
He had to have the meeting set up that way, and I was working, so I got there late, but I did hear his last few minutes of the speech, which of course he was not going to take any questions. But he said, blah, blah, blah. I said, but I'm not going to talk about what's going on in Washington.
Right.
Okay? So he said, right? And so that was his thing.
Yeah.
But he did not know, but now he knows, and he got the flyer on Harkin. He did not know, and that's not a surprise since it was just a couple of days ago. And, but he now knows, and Jessica's going to hold him to this with a witness of an aide. He has agreed now to meet personally with Jessica, not through an aide.
All right.
And then of the 10 contacts that Jessica made, we're going to organize some of those people who are constituents, along with some of us else, to meet with him.
Right.
So he's far from off the hook.
Right. Good work. Okay.
I think Alan's annoyed.
Yes.
Explain a little more what you mean that man is not evolved like we have.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, I'm still kind of working it out in my mind too. So I'll put it this way. What I know is that creativity does not come, human creativity, the ability to discover a true principle of the universe, does not come from man's biology. So I know that.
You know it in your heart or something.
Because I've experienced it.
Where do you think it came from?
Human creativity?
Yes?
Well, think of it this way. How to put it? I mean, I think the best way to think of it is actually not from the standpoint of the present, of what we're experiencing, but to think of it from the standpoint of a premonition or a forecast of the future. And for the solar system to fulfill a higher and higher state of development, it needed a creature that could actually act in the way that we know that man does. Now the reason is because when you're talking about animals, merely biological organisms, you're really talking about a kind of organism that can only exist in the present. It reacts to the state of the world around it, right? It does. It reacts to the moment. It interacts with the world as it is. Its processes, it's what it does. It's all a reaction to now. Now, for the human being, that's not true. The human being can actually act on a state which doesn't seem to be manifest at the moment, but which it intends to bring into being. And it is really a creative act. Like one, just to throw out maybe a different kind of example than we've been talking about, take Joan of Arc, who, this was 1430, I think, that she died. It was right around there. The action of Joan of Arc was inspired by a complete conviction about the nature of man and the notion of a nation, which didn't exist at the time. It's not something she picked up around her, right? But this tremendous action on her part was from something that didn't exist. But then what was the consequence? The consequence of what she did was the Renaissance, was a transformation in the culture brought about through the Renaissance, through the action of somebody like Cusa, who was inspired by her to create the basis for a modern nation state. So in a very real way, even if she didn't have all the details worked out, she was seized by something and was responding to something that didn't exist. And so like where that is, you know, in the universe, I mean, I don't know, maybe the most accurate answer I can give now is it's in the future. Whereas human creativity, it's in the future. A creative act is the tapping into something which doesn't exist, but which we intend to organize to exist. And so that's what I mean by the fact that man is not a biological creature. It's that distinction. So that's what I would say. And I know Mr. LaRouche, he does have a more profound idea of it than what I just expressed. I'm sure of it, because since he's gotten back from Germany, which was, I don't know what, like a week or two ago, he's just been completely engrossed with trying to communicate whatever is in his head about the nature of the human species and the human species not being a beast. And he hasn't been satisfied with any of our dialogue on it yet. So anyway, that's what I would say.
So you don't think that this is just a further development from where the animals are?
No.
This came from outer space or from God?
No, not in that way.
So in what way?
I mean, like one problem we get into, and it's not something wrong, but it's a difficulty we get into when we try to think about this, is actually the way in which we experience time. Because, I mean, we have certain assumptions about what caused something else based on how we actually experience time. So, for example, the abiotic seems to have existed before the biotic. And how do we know that? Because there's a certain time before which we can't detect any kind of evidence of life on the planet. Then there is a certain time period where we begin to detect evidence of life on the planet. So we pinpoint and say life started here. And then there's a certain time archaeologically when we can pinpoint the emergence of man, for sure. And we can say man started here. Now, that's...
But you're saying man started here, okay, but he didn't come from the animals, he came from somewhere else.
Oh, I'm saying causally. I'm not saying necessarily, I'm saying when you're talking about what came first or what came from what, I'm saying there's a difference between how we might experience something in what I just laid out about this came first, then that, then that. There's a difference between that and causality. What actually caused something else? Now, Einstein brings this up in a very interesting way in an interview where he's discussing the fight in the realm of the quantum theory, where he says, look, you know, people are criticizing me and saying that I'm holding on to a classical causality. But he says, I'm not holding on to classical causality. I'm just holding on to the idea that there is causality. And he says, look, I wish I had the quote, but he said he compared the ordering principles that we are witnessing with phenomena like the quantum to the kind of complex causality you would get in a Bach fugue, where it's not one note which leads to another note, which leads to another note, but there's actually a much more complex conception of organization which is guiding the succession of notes. And I mean, you get the same kind of thing in a poem, where the kind of complex structure of the poem is not a linear structure, right? And in the case of poetry and of music, the structure of the words and the unfolding of the sentences or the unfolding of the notes is much more guided by the future, by the end of the composition. which doesn't yet exist, than it is by what came before.
What comes later gives meaning to what came before it, in a certain
Yeah.
sense.
Well, that's one way you could express it. I mean, I think there's more to it, but sure. What comes later gives meaning to and defines what came prior. But then that, I think, raises a paradox of what is prior in nature? If what seems to have come later actually defines and gives meaning to what came earlier, which one's first?
Well, the conception.
Doesn't matter.
Hmm?
Well, the artist has it in his mind,
Right.
and it colors and defines the process to which he gets that
Right.
in the actual piece. But the piece, with its fullness,
Mm-hmm.
is already somewhere in there.
Mm-hmm. Now, can you imagine the solar system as a composition? Can you imagine, use the analogy, because I think what you said is true. Can we use that analogy to consider the unfolding of the composition of the planet within a solar system, within a galaxy?
But what has that got to do with the question that I've been hearing here, that man did not evolve from the animals?
Because there's a wholeness. Just like you were referencing the wholeness of the artistic composition, there is a one to the universe. There's a wholeness. Now, it's not something which, we don't know everything yet. The human species certainly doesn't know everything.
We're
Right.
just at the very beginning
Yeah.
of being knowledgeable about this thing as a whole.
Right, but the more we explore it, and here's the interesting thing, the more we explore it, the more we actually find a coherence. We're finding more and more of a coherence of what's becoming a more and more complex thing, right, for us. And I think that's the issue, and it is a paradox. I mean, it is a
I
paradox.
still don't understand why you
Mhm.
are saying man did not come from the animals. Isn't he just finally getting beyond the limitations of the here, the now, the instant where, the cat looks for food? I mean, we're beyond that now. But, we've got the eyes, the nose, the mouth, the lungs, the heart that the cat has.
Why would we have
From that.
had to have evolved from that?
Where did man come from?
Actually, maybe a better way to put it, man's not his body, is he? The human species is not his body.
He's grown. He's become something more.
He is something more, in a very real way. Yeah, thanks for coming.
So you're saying he came from outer space into
No, I'm
this
not.
body?
No, I'm not saying that. I mean, I think it's a difficult idea. But what I'm saying is that, yeah, some people say that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is the body is not mankind, and that the body that right now, yeah, I mean, there's a mind. But here's the thing. I mean, think about one example: curiosity on Mars. Okay, imagine we had, which we should, many curiosities on the planet Mars. In a very real sense, humankind, or the scientists who are operating that thing and are using that thing, in a very real way, are also animating and inhabiting that little being on Mars at the same time that you're inhabiting your body. Because here's the thing. Animals are fixed in their biological apparatus. We're not fixed. We're extending our senses all the time. We're building new senses for ourselves all the time, which we rely on at this point, right? So, and we were born with a certain, as LaRouche puts it, out of the box, which I like. We're born with like a starter kit, this body, right? Like a starter kit of senses and functionality. But over the course of time, we've actually expanded that using different instrumentation, different satellites, different ways of penetrating, sensing, knowing, and acting in the universe. And in a very real way, the mind is controlling and inhabiting those things as a certain set in the same way that we inhabit, you could say, our body. So what I'm saying is that we're not limited to the body.
No,
right?
no. still came from, started.
But what's causal? I mean, sure. But what's primary? Why was the body created? The body was created because something needed a creative thing to be able to act and expand out. Sure.
Who created us the way Beethoven created a symphony.
Yeah, I mean but that's a religious expression of it, but it's also a scientific idea. Right?
Hello. I want to throw some gasoline on the fire. There is a group of people that are known as ancient astronaut theorists. And they, from reading and interpreting the Babylonian texts, the ones that the British have in their museum, reading the Babylonian texts, they so-called created gods, they have reasoned were actually like astronauts. And that human beings were created as a workforce for these people. And this is the genesis of the Bible stories in all the different creation stories and creation mythology throughout the planet. That these people, supposedly, whoever they are, they mention only 2 of them, came from outer space, and they reasoned that they did genetic engineering.
Yeah, there's a lot that's said.
Existing species,
I think
so
so.
that they could become the human race that we are
Yeah,
today.
there's a lot that's said, but that's not what we're saying. No. No, there's a lot that's said, but
This is archaeology.
Megan has 5 minutes left, and then we got to talk about the activism. So let's get closer to the heart of the question.
Is there anybody else with a question? Maybe somebody who hasn't asked one yet?
You said what's causal?
Huh?
You said what's causal? Causality.
Yeah. You asking or you?
You were speaking about that, and I just lost the line of thought that talking about.
Yeah, no.
Space, people from.
Yeah, I mean, it is like the sense of the artist, right? The artist has the conception, which spurs him to find the material in which to embody it, right? So an observer from the outside, like us sitting in a performance in a concert hall, we receive the material. We observe the notes, right? Right? And then at the end of the composition, hopefully you get the idea. It sort of occurs in a reverse order for us, right?
You mean they comes at the end, not at the beginning.
You know what the problem is
Yeah.
that we're running into as an organization that you probably trying to put some real headway to, is that people want a logical way of thinking about how man came into being. And so the creationist story that God created heaven and earth, and then he, on the 6th day, he created man from the earth, and all of that is logically palatable. It makes you feel good. It makes you feel okay. That's how it happened. That makes sense to me. It satisfies me, soothes my anxiety about where we came from, and it answers everything. And so I'm going to stick to that God thing, because I get it all the time in my classroom where kids say, "How can you be a scientist, Ms. White, and believe that the universe was created and man came into the universe from processes from the universe that enabled us, like the little cyanobacteria that put that oxygen in the air, and then the next process was things crawled up or walked up or whatever onto the land, and then that process got to an extent where the planet was now ready for a creature, us, that could house the thoughts, the mind, and keep the planet going so we could go to higher and higher levels. And yet, I also believe in a spiritual explanation. And they, they find it hard to accept that anybody can have both ways, can deal with it both ways. People want that soothing creativity thing. They want that. It's difficult to think of it as processes within the universe. Then where did we come from? Then where did we come from? Then how did we get here? If we didn't evolve from an ape, we didn't jump up on 2 feet instead of crawling around on 4s and say, well, now I'm no longer a monkey, I'm a man. Then where did we come from? Well, God created heaven and earth, and in the 6th day, he did this, and he put all the fruit there, and this, that, he got the garden. That's comforting.
One thing I'll throw into what you're saying, I was just thinking it through. One thing I will throw in is we also are running up against a certain issue of sense perception. Because who's to say that a creative being, which we can prove man to be, only existed when we can detect his body, right? It is, again, kind of getting back to the assumption that man is just the body. Well, what is the body? It's something which I can see. It's something which I can touch, has solidity, right? This kind of thing. So the statement that man came into being on whenever it was X million years ago, it's not really a statement of the existence of creativity or even concentrated creativity like we are, individual manifestation of creativity. It's a certain statement about when, something which we call the body might have come into existence. But it does raise the question of, where was creativity before man? Or to roll back a little bit, where was life, right, before? I don't mean like, oh, it was on Mars. I mean, kind of, if you have a it's very paradoxical, right? It is very paradoxical because how do we know what's living? Well, we know it's living because there's this living body, right? But as we know, the materials of the living body aren't life. So how do we identify life? It might not always take the form that we expect it to. And so anyway, I mean, these are very difficult ideas. It's very paradoxical.
I think one of the roots of what a lot of people are talking about is it comes down, I mean, in my mind, as an English teacher, it comes down to Poe versus Conan Doyle, Sherlock Holmes versus Edgar Allan Poe. And I think you get a lot of these things with the Bible that you brought up, Jessica, when people mistake something that's metaphor that is with maybe the limits that we've developed our written language to, at least literally, and maybe they're not meant to be literal, to express something that is higher, that is greater, that is truly us. But the language that we use needs to be used in a different way than the visceral sense or the sense perception, the literal matter. And Poe shows us that, Poe teaches us that, which is why the British created Sherlock Holmes, Conan Doyle, to sort of reduce us to this idea of, well, you need to have a logical, empirical explanation. If there's no empiricism, it can't exist. And I think that's a big problem.
Yeah, it's a question of how do you detect these things, right? It's what you're saying. How do we actually detect life? How do we detect a creative being, right?
You have to learn to live with uncertainty.
But there's so much that we do know that we can use to know what we don't know yet. That's also the idea. It bothers me when people tend to say, well, we don't know this, we don't know that, you're right, we don't know everything, as sort of expressing the intention or the excuse to say, well, we can never know. No, we don't know so much, but from what we do know, we can figure out what we don't know truthfully. And I think that's the point.
Okay, we can talk afterwards. We should probably stop. We gotta get out of this room at a certain point.